Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to the post 78, Managing Up, with a question mark at the end. This post comes via request from Dr. D. Hi, Dr. D. And the request was a very interesting one. He has completed his own PhD to great success, but he has suffered, and that's the correct word, suffered incredibly poor supervision. Okay, that's fine, but he's finished. But his next question was, how does he not replicate the supervision that he experienced? He's got a data set of one, and it was poor supervision. How does he stop the cycle and become a better supervisor? And this is the conventional story we so often hear that I talked about a lot in my book, The Pernicious PhD Supervisor. His supervisor, of course, started off as the absent supervisor, just not there. I called them the Loch Ness monster supervisor. And then at the end, in the final 3-4 months, when there was really grunty work to do, the supervisor sort of had to do something and then manifested into the Chihuahua supervisor. Not doing much and complaining about it a lot. But of course, then there was the final stage. The thesis was successful, did incredibly well, some lovely dissemination and great public profile. And of course, at that point, the supervisor was sort of claiming the research from the student, becoming what I described in my book as the wizard supervisor. Okay, that's quite a conventional narrative. An incompetent supervisor who sort of does very little, complains about it, and then of course claims it at the end if the student is successful. Neglect, unfortunately, is one of the tropes and almost the punctuation of what exists in supervision. This isn't a new thing. You often heard me talk about my supervisor when dinosaurs roamed the earth. This guy just did nothing. He was absolutely incompetent. And then, of course, the wizard claimed at the end, supposedly, how great he was because my thesis was successful without him. You get the story. But looking back on his candidature, Dr. D is looking for a way of creating an intervention with himself, a Dr. Phil intervention in himself, to create a better model or a different way of thinking about supervision. And he asked me if the managing up theories and tropes are of use. So is that a way to think about power in a different way in the supervisory relationship? And it's an interesting question which I've taken very seriously, and I've looked at the old research that goes way back to the early mid-1980s and research that's only a couple of months old. So this is a big paradigm, and I have taken this request seriously. But look, let me put my lens in first before I take it out again. So my lens is that the phrase managing up comes from corporate management. It comes from the leadership industry. So line management is what is in existence. That's the structure. So, okay, we're in a business corporate environment and line management is in place. There is a line between a boss and a subordinate worker. And that line management is tracked and mapped through a thing called an organizational chart, an org chart. So all the hard lines of the line management are in place, and often you then have what are called the soft or dotted lines where different people have different influences over a worker. Again, all of this is confirming the power that particular people have over others. So that is line management. And universities are not those sorts of businesses. Well, they shouldn't be. And in fact, of course, they're not businesses. We have different types of power structures, power relationships, credibility, integrity, beyond sort of simple line management and organisational power. But let me correct myself. Universities do have org charts and they do have line management, and universities are becoming more and more like just any other business. And we do hear a lot these days about line management in our university. So this is a thing. Now, yes, dear friends, this is the end of the world, but, and this is sort of a mega Brabazon, but The relationship between a student and a supervisor, that is not line management. That is a learning relationship. This is a student-teacher relationship. This is a, if you want to go there, master-apprentice relationship, or Jedi and Padawan, if you want to go there. So let's just start there. My big corrective is this is a learning relationship and not a line management relationship. And the more that we park or minimize the learning in a PhD relationship, the more toxic the supervision can become. A supervisor is not your boss. They are your teacher. We forget about this a lot when we use words like supervisors or advisors, right? These people are teachers. Supervising a PhD is teaching. Now, I've put all those caveats in place, so there we go. There's my lens. Let's click it out and show for Dr. D if there is actually something of value here going forward as a model, a trope, a theory, a way of thinking about power in a supervisory relationship to help him become the great supervisor that I know he will be. Okay. Now, remember, just hold on to that supervisor-student learning relationship, not line management. Different things. So let's get into this. Now, leadership is defined in many ways. I define it as an ownership over choices and decisions, a responsibility for those choices and decisions, and the building of trust with colleagues based on integrity and based on respect. Now, from the 1980s in particular, the power relationships, the positional power in organisations started to be talked about a lot. And in 1986, at the height of the greed is good 1980s, Bartlome and Laurent stated that, quote, managing relationships up, down and across helps build productive relationships and credibility within the organisation. Okay, productive relationships and credibility. Let's carry that forward. Good. So we've got productivity, we've got efficiency, we've got credibility. But what's going on with this upwards, downwards and across thing? Now, to cite Badowski, who is a remarkable scholar in this field, has written with a lot of great scholars as well over the last 20 years. All of this is about managing up, building a productive relationship with your boss, line management. It requires an understanding of your boss as an individual, their positional power, their needs, their expectations, and how you as a worker can exceed their expectations. So we're not getting too much out of this theory so far. We have to recognise the challenges that particularly exist for a PhD student, because PhD students are already exploited, taken for granted and marginalised. That is the culture. It's not a good culture, don't agree with this. But do we really need students doing even more for their supervisors? Seriously. So where this paradigm, I think, does have value is with regard to communication and the development of a communication system. So managing up is about configuring an open and shared communication system, a shared language, a shared understanding. My language, this is building of an organisational literacy. Great. But instead of focusing on managing up, how about we just focus on creating a very strong and effective communication system? And that's important. And the way, when we create a good and effective communication system, it's a very strong way to mitigate and manage power relationships. So communication matters a lot. Power inequalities and injustices become worse and more problematic if we don't share that language. Okay. Now, there's a heavily cited source from Fallon, and this was published in 2016, And he offered at its most basic 3 do's and 3 don'ts in managing up. And look, this is pretty straightforward. So the do's are: 1, tune in to your leader, understand their personal values and their professional values, and then start to develop shared goals. Okay. 2, note the leader's preferred communication style. Do they like face-to-face? Do they like email? And understand how they make decisions. Great. 3, jump in with suggestions. If you can provide solutions and initiative, then do so. Great. Okay, so they're the do's of managing up. Great. What are the 3 don'ts of managing up? Right. Don't manipulate the boss or present unrealistic expectations. Don't cover up or blame other people for your mistakes. And don't play favourites. Right. All of these mantras seem fine to me. I'm not sure if all of that is actually managing up or just being a decent, ethical human being. But still, moving on. The phrase manage up was added to by the quite remarkable Karen Grant and she's written again on this for the last 20 years or so, but her remarkable latest piece from November 2024. And she described managing up as, quote, a professional skill, end of quote, and managing up was about showing initiative. Right. She also confirmed that managing up was, quote, a way to quickly advance up the corporate ladder, end of quote. So what we're attempting to do in this model is demonstrate to your boss that you are effective, that you are efficient, that you can collaborate with your boss to help them reach their objectives. This is pretty straightforward stuff, right? And it requires the individual worker to adapt to the style of the boss, offering solutions and not just problems, and being a resource for the boss. Okay, so you can already see that this model is probably great for an ambitious person who wants to move up the ranks, because you become visible and you become a person that solves problems, right? So that's how you are visible in an organisation and how you are promoted in that organisation. But again, we need to return to the fact that a PhD supervisor and a student, that relationship is about learning. And it's also about a flattening of the power relationship over the candidature. You've often heard me say so frequently, remember, say a PhD is 3 years. At the start of the 3 years, the supervisor is the expert. By about 18 months in, the student should know more than the supervisor on that topic. And by the end, they are the expert and they're helping the supervisor understand this field. That should be the arc. Frequently these days that's not the case, and there are many reasons for that, but that's what I mean about the flattening of power. It starts as the Jedi Knight, but it doesn't finish there. Okay. The whole point is the supervisor needs to help the student complete a PhD, and if the student's really lucky, they'll provide some information about how to supervise a PhD as well. I know in our current university sector, we are a very, very long way away from that premise, that argument, that outcome. What we've got are a large number of incompetent supervisors and a large amount of incompetent supervisory training. Right. But the failure of supervisors and the failure of supervisory training does not mean we simply have to take a trope from corporate line management and think that that's going to be an effective replacement. We need to address the failure. We've got bad supervisors and we've got bad supervisory training. That's what we need to address. We don't pinch something from corporate management that doesn't fit a learning relationship. Now, yes, I think there are some areas we can learn from here for Dr. D. This is great. What they talk about a lot in this type of theory is the importance of maintaining a paper trail. So what is the boss asking a person to do? How is it being done? So making sure it's all very transparent. That's a good idea. And also to understand your supervisor, their strengths, their weaknesses, and how they like to communicate with others. All of this is great. But remember, you are doing your PhD for yourself. You're not doing it for your supervisor. Things are getting very confused at this point. And that's why I think the focus on loyalty and commitment can be quite mistaken. Because you see, research integrity and academic integrity requires a loyalty and a commitment of a researcher, not to the supervisor, not even to yourself really. Research integrity requires we as researchers have a commitment and a loyalty to ethics and to high international standards. We don't have a connection to, a person and I'll do anything for this person, loyalty to a person. No, we have a commitment to international standards of excellence. That's what we do. That's what ethics is. So personal loyalty to a supervisor beyond policies, procedures, regulations, and indeed laws can create an absolute mess of a situation if and when a student or supervisor are found out. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. I had to train a supervisor, and I didn't really because he was an absolute shambles, but I had to train a supervisor who was an experimental scientist, right? So, heavy risk, heavy complicated area, required good transparent methodology. Anyway, here we go. But he came to me and approached every situation in his professional life with the mantra, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. It's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And that's how he trained his PhD students. Now, the trouble that this guy got into, and the trouble that he got his students into, was unbelievable. So, managing up, therefore, is not really the point. What is the point, therefore? Finishing the thesis as quickly as possible, keeping the relationship with the supervisor as civilized as possible, avoiding exploitation by the supervisor as much as possible, but most importantly, finishing quickly, starting a thesis, stopping a thesis, getting on with your life. That's what we're aiming to do here. And at its best, managing up is a soft skill. I'll use that phrase, is a soft skill, and it builds communication systems, it builds relationships, and that's great, fantastic. But always remember where the phrase managing up comes from. It comes from corporate management, it comes from the leadership industry. It's about an employee increasing their effectiveness, not for themselves, but for a corporation. And that's why it doesn't really fit for a PhD student. A PhD student is a PhD student. You are learning. You are not an unpaid or underpaid intern for a bank or a hedge fund. There is, I think, a lot of value in the discussion we've had today about communication systems, how you can match the communication system between your supervisor and you. That's really important. The working patterns of the supervisor and the student, that's great. And the research professional goals of the student and the supervisor, logging the most appropriate time of day where you both work, that's great. And how you like to receive feedback and how they like to give feedback and make those match. All of that's terrific. And I would argue all of this should emerge right at the start of the candidature in the first week. And of course, I do that as part of my setup document. Tens of thousands of students around the world, maybe more now, have used that setup document the week before they start their thesis. So most universities these days have guidelines about the relationship between students and supervisors. Some have a supervisory charter. So all of those documents are incredibly important because they formalise and concretise the relationship between you and your supervisor. And, you know, a learning management agreement, we're probably there, but a learning management agreement between a student and supervisor can be great. But I think managing up, that phrase, gives a supervisor too much power. It's giving your supervisor a pass, if you will, to behave like your boss, to exploit you and treat you as an unpaid or underpaid worker for them. And we don't need that now. This behaviour is not right, and it's against most staff and student codes of conduct. So set up your PhD program as a degree program. And for all of you that are moving from a PhD into an early career researcher role, set this up properly for your student. Set it up as a learning program. Backwardly map it. Do your homework. Understand the institutional policies and procedures. And please remember that you are a student. And I'm going to finish with two stories today. And these two stories are not really here to frighten you, although they may. But these stories exist to keep you wary, to assume that all the people around you are caring for your best interests, okay? We are regulating supervision very, very carefully now because we have to. So let me summon two stories from our past to show you why we need to regulate supervision. So, the first story, I'm sitting in a meeting with very, very senior research managers, you know, one of those managers at a particular university, and they're all talking about research strategy and vision and metrics and so forth, usual stuff. And then all of a sudden there was a bit of the conversation talking about higher degree students and the students wanting support, you know, in terms of getting jobs, in terms of research support, but also in terms of teaching support, you know, so they had a chance to get some teaching as well to help them get a job. Okay, all fair enough. But in response to this request, there was this horrific, nasty, toxic laughter, which is horrific in and of itself. And then once the laughter had sort of cooled a bit, a woman in the meeting, it had to be a woman, didn't it? A woman in the meeting described PhD students as slaves. Now that's appalling enough, but then the laughter returned once more. So PhD students were described as slaves and laughter resulted from that description. Remember that. To my second story. So I was an institutional leader for the research assessment exercise in the United Kingdom, and this sort of, you know, this sort of management group for the research assessment exercise got together in this big room, and we were compiling the institutional entry. And there were three characteristics of the RAE. There was a focus on publications, research higher degree, numbers of students and completions, and esteem factors. They were the three variables. And in this management meeting was the most stunning experience. It's still in the top 2 or 3 of the most bizarre things that have ever happened to me. And it was a great embarrassment to that university, and it is of, I would argue, great embarrassment to international higher education. But the researchers who had the esteem indicators and had the publications had the fewest PhD students and the fewest completions. So let's translate that. The supposedly best researchers in an institution were the worst supervisors. Now there are only 2 exceptions to that, and one of them was me, and the other was my late husband, Professor Steve Redhead. And we were both entered into a very small unit of assessment, so there weren't a lot of people in it. So, of course, there was the graph. It was like low, 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 with this incredible single spike and low, 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 low. So Steve and I were the only people that sort of spiked the result. So we had the publications, we had the esteem indicators, and we were also pretty good PhD supervisors and got students to completion. But I always remember, wow, the silence around that table as all these supposedly great researchers, look at me, look at me, look at me, had to confront the quant data set of a whole institution that showed that the best researchers were the worst supervisors. There was no way to sort of get out of that information, get out of that data set. That was true. And remember, this was not a few bad apples. This was all the supposedly high esteem research professors on the campus. And remember, that was a complete data set for an entire university, one university certainly, but a comprehensive university, all disciplines. The assumption I think we have is that a great researcher by particular metrics, most of which are invented, are great supervisors. That maxim is absolutely wrong. And what was the institutional response to this horrific nightmare that the best researchers were the worst high degree supervisors? And, you know, that was going to have huge consequences to the institutional entry for the RAE. Well, what happened was these research leaders added the poor supervisors, the great researchers, the poor supervisors to successful supervisory panels. So they were able to feed off and exploit the hard work done by colleagues to be great supervisors so that the institutional entry would not be impacted. So, selfish researchers are not the best supervisors. And indeed, you as students, you know this, because students are voting with their feet. Students now have so much information about prospective supervisors. You can read their work, you can check their involvement in articles. Have they spent the entirety of their life being author 8 of 17? Can they actually write? And of course, you can talk with their former students. You can look at thousands of posts in social media. You can work out what sort of person this is. And prospective students have more information about prospective supervisors now than at any point in history. Therefore, you need to find the great supervisors who are both, who are great researchers, they've got to be that, but they've also got to be able to teach, because supervision is teaching. And they've also got to be decent people rather than somebody who would have made a great guest on Jerry Springer. So therefore, don't manage up, don't manage down. Construct a learning culture of trust, integrity, and decency. I wish you love, light, and peace. T out.